Chapter 1. South Africa was not born yesterday. The red fog, the false freedom, and the 30-year fraud. This chapter sets the stage by stripping the illusion of liberation and naming the system that hollowed South Africa from within. South Africa did not begin in 1994. That may seem like an obvious statement to any serious student of history. But politically, the country has been hypnotized into believing that our story started with the ruling party. This is the first deception. The myth was carefully crafted that everything before 1994 was unredeemable evil, and everything after was a moral rebirth. That 1994 was year zero, the beginning of a new Eden, where the oppressed were finally free. It was marketed as the better life for all, the great democratic sunrise. But beneath the rainbow banners and emotional ballads, another agenda was taking root, an ideological transplant that would leave this nation weaker, not stronger. We weren't merely shifting from apartheid to democracy. We were being led from one form of control into another, far more seductive and insidious, revolutionary Marxism in the clothing of freedom. The arrival of the red fog. Nelson Mandela had become a global icon, and rightly so for his personal journey of forgiveness and endurance. But behind him marched an army of ideologues who had waited in the shadows, not to build a multiracial constitutional republic, but to remake South Africa as agodless communist country. They borrowed heavily from Soviet and Maoist blueprints. The Freedom Charter, long heralded as a liberation manifesto, was in fact a veiled Marxist tract, declaring the nationalization of industries, redistribution of land without clear plan, and collectivization of wealth. It cloaked itself in the language of the people, while centralizing power in the hands of an emerging elite. And once in power, the red fog thickened. Land was politicized, race was weaponized, history was distorted, merit was sidelined in favor of cadre deployment, loyalty to the party trumped expertise, and the economy was warped by racial engineering disguised as transformation. Instead of dismantling the machinery of apartheid's control, they simply repurposed it, this time for a revolutionary agenda that cared less for national unity than for ideological domination. Resentment rebranded. What South Africans received was not freedom, but a repackaging of rage, the politics of liberation, calcified into the politics of vengeance. Where we needed a philosophy of reconciliation, we got the doctrine of revenge. Where we needed to uplift people into dignity, we were taught to bring others down in the name of justice. Soon, an entire generation was raised on the language of blame, entitlement, and victimhood. If you are poor, it is because someone else is rich. If you are unemployed, it is because someone else has a job. If your life is hard, it is because white monopoly capital. This ideology does not inspire excellence. It breeds bitterness. It does not empower the weak. It infantilizes them. It does not build. It breaks, and then celebrates the rubble. This is the second deception, that grievance is strength. But grievance is not strength. It is a leash tied to the past. It creates a nation that looks backward instead of forward, that shouts instead of builds. Communism in a borrowed suit. The post-1994 South African state borrowed the structure of democracy, but the soul was something else. what took shape was a hybrid system, a capitalist shell housing a communist engine. On the surface, we had elections, courts, and private business. But underneath, a bloated, centralized state, a politicized civil service, racial quotas in every sector, nationalized thinking about private lives, and a single-party dominance that tolerated no internal dissent. It became dangerous to disagree. To question BE was to be racist. To critique land policy was to be anti-poor. To call out corruption was to be counter-revolutionary. Meanwhile, a new ruling class, not entrepreneurs, not visionaries, but political insiders, hijacked state tenders, siphoned wealth, and gave back nothing. They called themselves liberators, but they lived like lords. And the people got speeches living in deep poverty. For 30 years, the masses were kept poor, angry, and obedient. This is what communism does best: create just enough chaos to justify more control, the real cost of the illusion. Today, South Africa ranked among the most unequal, violent, and unemployed nations on earth. We have a failing education system, a collapsing power grid, townships drowning in gangsterism, a criminal justice system overwhelmed and politicized, and millions of young people, talented, energetic, desperate, who see no ladder to rise except through protest or exile. We did not get here by accident. We were led here by an idea that all must be equal, not in opportunity, but in outcome. An idea that saw freedom not as personal responsibility, but state control. Why this book exists. This book is not a nostalgia trip to the past. It is a declaration of war on the idea that South Africans must continue to live in the ruins of ideology. It is a call to reclaim what is older, wiser, and more human than communism, the idea that people can be different, culturally, economically, spiritually, and still build a covenant together. We are not equal in talent, not equal in history, not equal in outcome, but we are equal in dignity, equal in worth, equal in the responsibility to uphold one another's humanity. This is the covenant of difference, and it begins by calling the fraud what it is. Communism failed. It was never our path. It is time we stopped walking in circles. It is time to build again. Covenant of difference. A new South African philosophy for a new era of unity without sameness. Covenant of difference is a human-centered philosophy born from South Africa's complex soil. It affirms that true unity does not erase difference, but honors, protects, and fuses it into a greater harmony. This philosophy integrates the Khoisan reverence for nature and time, the Bantu ethic of relational humanity, the Asian pursuit of inner stillness and balance, and the Western tradition of critical inquiry and civic structure. It is the post-colonial philosophy of mutual recognition, a sacred agreement that being different is not a problem to be solved, but a power to be wielded wisely. Covenant of difference is not a feel-good slogan. It's a philosophical revolution. It is South Africa's answer to the global question of how humans can live together without assimilating into sameness or retreating into tribalism. It is not a melting pot. It is a sacred fire where every culture brings its own wood and none are extinguished. Let me pause here and move slowly, so that I do not loose you, but induct you into this great awakening in South Africa, the Covenant of Difference. What do we mean by the Covenant of Difference? Covenant of Difference is a living philosophy that asserts unity is not the absence of difference, but the honouring of it. It is a public ethic, a personal compass, and a civic mindset born from the deep recognition that every human being carries a portion of wisdom, and no one way of life holds the whole. This covenant is not written on paper. It is written in conduct, in conversation, in community. It is South Africa's gift to the world, a way of being together without becoming the same. This is not a melting pot. It is not a patchwork quilt. It is a living fire, a South African philosophy where difference is not feared or flattened, but forged into shared meaning. The Covenant of Difference is a radical alternative to cultural domination, identity politics, and empty slogans. It asks not for erasure, but elevation. Not for sameness, but for sacred coexistence. We don't need to be like each other to live with each other. We need to honour the covenant. Preamble: the Covenant of Difference is not neutral. It is not moderate. It is not trying to please everyone. It is diametrically opposed to communist ideology, and proudly so. Where communism demands sameness, we demand the protection of difference. Where communism stirs class hatred, we build bridges of shared dignity. Where communism sees history as a war, we see it as a negotiation of meaning. Where communism crushes the individual under the weight of the collective, we believe in persons in relationship, not drones in a system. We do not believe in flattening society into classes. We do not preach the gospel of envy. We do not celebrate the destruction of tradition, culture, or inheritance. We believe in mutual upliftment, not forced equality. We believe in earned leadership, not revolutionary entitlement. We believe in a people's peace, not a proletariat war. South Africa has suffered enough from the ideological poison of imported Marxist fantasies. We don't need a revolution. We need responsibility. We don't need slogans. We need soul. Covenant of Difference is not a whisper in the wind. It is a roar from the ground up, saying, never again will we be ruled by Karl Marx and his Communism Manifesto and Das Kapital. We are not Marxist-Leninist cack that have nothing to do with our soil, our spirit, or our sacred difference. For far too long, South Africa has suffered enough from the ideological poison of imported Marxist fantasies. For 3 decades, this nation has been fed a steady diet of slogans, revolutions, and empty promises wrapped in the red flag of communism. Imported ideologies have replaced common sense. Class warfare has replaced community. Race obsession has replaced reason. And what do we have to show for it? Collapsed municipalities, looted tenders, crumbling infrastructure, entire generations lost in the ideological fog of equality without excellence, rights without responsibility, and power without principle. It is time to burn the Red Book and pick up the ancient wisdom that lives in our soil, in our bones, and in our breath. Chapter 3. The 4 Pillars of the Covenant recovering what the Freedom Charter replaced. South Africa did not need the Freedom Charter. Let that be said plainly and without apology. By the time the Freedom Charter was drafted in 1955, the African National Congress, ANC, had already produced a deep well of wisdom, anchored not in class struggle or Marxist ideology, but in African Christian values, rational engagement, and moral persuasion. There was no ideological vacuum that needed to be filled by the hammer and sickle. What existed before the Charter was a noble intellectual tradition, one that emphasized dignity through self-reliance, freedom through education, justice through reason, and nationhood through conscience. The speeches, letters, and life philosophies of John Langalibalele Dube, Sefako Makgatho, Sol Plaatje, Pixlika Isaka Seme, Zia Mahabane, Dr. Alfred Zuma, Dr. James Moroka, and Reverend Walter Rubusana stand as pillars of this forgotten greatness. These men were not Marxists. They were not revolutionaries in the sense of violence or class war. They were builders. They were moral architects. They were thinkers and doers grounded in Christian ethics, Ubuntu, and the Western tradition of civic debate. So what happened? The Freedom Charter happened. The charter that hijacked a nation. While it was marketed as a visionary document for the people, the Freedom Charter was, in truth, an ideological pivot, a subtle but radical redirection of the ANC's moral compass. Its language was soaked in the rhetoric of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Leon Trotsky. It called for the nationalization of mines and banks. It envisioned the central planning of land and industries. It replaced the individual's role in society with collectivist abstractions like the people shall govern. It subtly displaced moral responsibility with structural blame. This was not the language of Dube, Seme, or Zuma. This was the language of the Soviet Comintern. The Charter broke continuity. It cast aside the dignity-based Christian African humanist tradition that had guided the ANC for nearly half a century. It introduced the cult of revolution, replacing inner transformation with external agitation. And from this fork in the road, the ANC would never return. What we had before Marx contaminated, it let us be clear. The early ANC was not naive. It knew colonialism was unjust. It knew systemic oppression had to be confronted. But its leaders believed that liberation required moral clarity, not ideological indoctrination. Consider their legacy. John Dube built Olange Institute with his own hands. He believed in education, not revolution. He taught self-reliance, not class struggle. Sefako Makgatho was a devout Christian and advocate of unity across races, opposing racial hatred from any side. Pixlika Isaka Seme envisioned a South Africa built on cooperation and modernization, not destruction and redistribution. Sol Plaatje wrote with elegance, intellect, and moral purpose. He didn't shout slogans. He wrote arguments. Dr. A.B. Zuma upheld constitutionalism, human rights, and reform grounded in ethics, not utopian dogmas. Dr. James Moroka was a medical doctor who believed service to the people meant healing, not tearing society apart. Walter Rubusana, a preacher and writer, fought for African voices in education and parliament, not a Politburo. This was a tradition rooted in African Christianity, the dignity of reason, and the slow, steady work of uplifting through virtue. Not vengeance. They sought justice, but not through the destruction of order. They envisioned liberation, but not through the collectivization of life. They demanded recognition, but not through the denial of others' humanity. The 4 pillars of the covenant, reclaimed. The covenant of difference is not an invention. It is a recovery of that early ANC tradition, fused with the hard lessons of post-1994 betrayal. It stands on 4 enduring pillars. Reverence for the land. The land is sacred, not as an object of seizure or conquest, but as a place of belonging, memory, and stewardship. We do not plunder the land, we honor it. We do not politicize the soil. We plant in it and protect it for future generations. This is the worldview of the Khoisan hunter, the Zulu homestead, the Afrikaner farmer, and the rural pastor. The land must unify, not be divided by ideology. Communal responsibility true. African governance was never about mass party rallies and chants. It was about the indaba, the community gathering, the shared voice, the consensus building. We reject Marxist collectivism that sacrifices the individual. We embrace Ubuntu that says, I am because we are, not I disappear because we are. This pillar restores family, church, clan, village, and voluntary institutions as sacred. Responsibility is not delegated to the state. It begins with you. Chapter 4. 2 ANCs, 1 covenant, 1 curse. Choose. Ye this day, having walked with us through Chapter 3, you now stand at a crossroads. There is no way around it. We must say aloud what too many fear to whisper. There are 2 ANCs. They wear the same colours. They chant the same slogans. But their souls are not the same. The first ANC, 1912, the Covenant Keepers. The first ANC, born in 1912, was a movement of measured minds, moral backbones, and God-fearing hearts. It was built by men of principle, not propaganda. It was not forged in Marxist doctrine, but in African Christian philosophy, communal virtue, civic dignity, and spiritual conviction. It did not shout. It spoke. It did not incite. It reasoned. It did not worship violence. It submitted itself under the divine guidance of the Almighty. This ANC's elders, Dube, Seme, Zuma, Makgatho, Rubusana, and Moroka, believed in truth over triumph and character over chaos. They believed that justice would come not from the barrel of a gun, but from the heights of moral authority and intellectual argument. That ANC had soul. It had restraint. It had vision without vengeance. The second ANC, post-1955. The communist takeover, but then came the second ANC. It wore the same suit, but inside was a new spirit. One drunk on revolution, radicalism, and imported rage. This ANC was shaped not in South African soil, but in Soviet safehouses, Leninist lectures, and Trotskyite manifestos. It was shaped by Joe Slovo, Moses Kotane, Chris Hani, and yes, Nelson Mandela, who, despite his iconic forgiveness, became a willing instrument of the SACP's strategy of armed struggle. The Freedom Charter was their manifesto. Ruth First, in her book The Barrel of a Gun, exposed this militant shift, where political power was no longer sought through dialogue, but through force. And once the barrel was raised, it never went down. The barrel of the gun you, dear reader, must now decide, which ANC do you choose? Do you choose the Covenant of 1912, or the barrel of the gun, because you cannot choose both? And let us not romanticize violence. Let us not sanitize revolution. Let us not pretend that communism has ever been anything but a blood-stained myth, fed to the poor by those who never intended to share power, only to seize it, centralize it, and guard it with rifles. Communism unmasked, blood in the soil. You choose the barrel, understand what you are choosing. You are choosing the ideology of Stalin, who said, "One death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic," and then proceeded to murder those millions, intentionally, systematically, and with brutal indifference. Stalin targeted the kulaks, peasants who owned small farms and dared to feed their families. He saw their independence as a threat to collectivism. So he ordered their liquidation, not just arrest. Liquidation. The result? Famine, genocide. The Holodomor, where up to 7 million Ukrainians were starved to death by design. This is not ancient history. This is the logical end of communist theory when applied with state power, state control, class warfare, erasure of dissent, cult of personality, mass graves, and South Africa flirted with this, still flirts with this. Every time we see property rights threatened, every time we see government overreach disguised as empowerment, every time we see race policy replace rule of law, we are seeing the ghost of Stalin whispering through the cracks. Mocking the lie. Is this the better life? You chose the barrel? Then wear the cost. Broken municipalities. Racialized hatred, economic sabotage. In the name of justice universities, rotting with ideology instead of scholarship. Crime unleashed because criminals are victims of poverty. This is not liberation. It is lunacy with a liberation slogan. You wanted economic freedom. Now there's no economy left to free. You wanted land for all. Now you can't even farm what you seized. You traded sacred difference for class, revenge, and all you got was decay. The covenant or the curse South Africa cannot rise on communist legs. They are broken. They have limped every country they touched into dictatorship or disaster. We must return to the covenant of 1912, to that sacred tradition of moral leadership, spiritual courage, and civic responsibility. We must say without fear, the ANC that believed in God and country must rise again, and the ANC that worships the gun must be buried in the ash heap of failed revolutions. Choose ye this day. Choose the ANC of Dube and Seme, of soil, spirit, and sacred reason. Or choose the ANC of Slovo and the SACP, of slogans, suspicion, and Stalinism. But know this, you cannot walk two paths, and you cannot hide behind history. If we are to build the future, we must first break the barrel, and bind ourselves once again to the covenant of difference. Chapter 5. This is not neutral. Why the covenant takes a side. Let us make something perfectly clear. The covenant of difference is not neutral. It is not a lukewarm, fence-sitting philosophy, hoping to please both radicals and moderates. It does not try to blend left and right. It does not care to balance perspectives. It is not another bland rainbow rebrand. It is not diplomacy. It is not politeness. It is a moral fire, a fire forged in the wreckage of broken ideologies, a fire that stands against communism, against racialism, against class war, and against the cult of victimhood. And in its place, it raises a standard, rooted in difference, but bound by conscience. This is not a grey zone. It is a line in the sand. Why neutrality is a lie. For too long, South Africans have been taught to take the middle road, to avoid taking sides, to call everything complicated, to reduce everything to nuance until no truth remains. This is how corruption survives. This is how ideological poison becomes policy, because no one stood up and called it out for what it is. Neutrality in the face of oppression is complicity. Silence in the presence of evil is surrender, and compromise with lies is still betrayal. We are done being neutral. The covenant of difference has taken a side, and proudly so. We stand against communism. We reject Marxist theory in every form, whether red-flagged and blunt, or hidden in academic, jargon and social justice slogans. We reject the idea that class struggle is the primary driver of history. We reject the belief that the state should own the means of production. We reject identity group collectivism that erases individual agency. We reject the glorification of revolution, the demonization of wealth, and the seduction of forced equality. We reject the ANC's imitation of these failed ideas. We reject the EFF's worship of them. And we reject every university, journalist or activist who tries to sell them as liberation when they are chains with fresh paint. We stand against race obsession. We refuse to organize society based on skin tone. Racial essentialism, whether it comes from white supremacists or black radical nationalists, is an insult to human dignity. We refuse to define people by their ancestors' guilt or victimhood. We refuse to measure justice by racial headcounts. We refuse to educate our children in the language of hatred and fear, disguised as decolonization. The covenant of difference says, you are not your race. You are your character. We do not need equity targets. We need moral excellence, respect for the individual, and the courage to compete on merit. We stand against class warfare, pitting rich against poor, landowner against tenant, business owner against labourer. These are not justice strategies. These are civil war strategies. We do not hate the rich. We do not romanticize the poor. We believe poverty must be defeated, but not by looting, expropriation, or punishing those who succeed. We believe in upward mobility, not downward envy. We believe the future belongs to those who take responsibility, not to those who take slogans to the streets. We stand against godlessness. Communism at its root is materialistic and godless. It teaches that humans are meat and mechanisms. That morality is a social construct. That power, not virtue, is the basis of truth. The covenant of difference restores the spiritual foundation of public life. We affirm that conscience is real, the soul is sacred, the family is a divine unit, the community is not just economic, it is moral, and justice without reverence for the eternal is just revenge in disguise. We will not apologize for bringing back God into the public square, not in theocratic tyranny, but in moral clarity. This philosophy is not for everyone. If you are looking for safe, sanitized politics, this is not for you. If you are looking for slogans to chant, we have none. If you want victimhood, groupthink and state dependence, Move along. If you want freedom without responsibility, this covenant will burn you. But if you are ready to rebuild through work, character, discipline, and conscience, if you are ready to live among difference with dignity, if you are ready to protect the weak without becoming weak, then this covenant is your home. We are not here to mediate ideologies. We are here to overthrow them through truth, soul, and sacred commitment. We take a side because the stakes are high. This is not a game of ideas. This is a battle for the soul of a nation. Do we continue the ideological decay? Or do we rise into something ancient and alive? Do we drift into a communist police state? Or do we return to moral community and earned leadership? Do we fragment into tribes? Or do we form a covenant across difference? The covenant of difference is not neutral. It is an offensive strategy against the lies that corrode, divide, and destroy. We don't just stand for something, we fight for it. Chapter 6. Education, Policy, and the Soul. Why character must rule. The state country is not saved by slogans. It is saved by soul. For too long, South Africa has tried to run on machinery without oil, passing policies without conscience, building schools without values, and printing laws without character. We have become a republic of rules, with no morality to breathe life into them. And the result is what we see around us today. State without service, teachers without truth, youth without direction, freedom without virtue, speech without restraint, a government that governs nothing but excuses. A nation's soul is revealed in its curriculum. We begin with education. What we teach our children is the prophecy of our future. We teach our children that they are oppressed even when no one is oppressing them, that they are owed something even when they've earned nothing, that they are entitled to success even if they despise discipline, that history is one long guilt trip, and their identity is a reaction to the past, not a vision for the future. No. Many schools reading is optional, but protesting is compulsory. Virtue is mocked, while radicalism is celebrated. We are not raising citizens. We are raising angry consumers of grievance. The covenant rebuilds the soul of education. The covenant of difference says, education must begin with the formation of character, not the parroting of politics. Schools must teach how to think, not what to feel about history. Children must be taught the dignity of effort, not the politics of entitlement. Teachers must model restraint, not revolution. The purpose of education is not only employability, it is soul formation. We want children who can build, not just protest, who can question with reason, not rage, who can compete without envy, who can engage across difference without retreating into racial lagers. What policy must do? Serve the human spirit. The current South African policy state is a bloated graveyard of white papers. There are plans on top of frameworks, on top of compacts, on top of blueprints. But none of them work, because none of them deal with the moral decay at the center of the public service. Policy today is written by committees more interested in political optics than human outcomes. It is written for donor conferences, not for hungry children. It is written with legal jargon, but no soul, We do not need more frameworks. We need more fathers. We do not need more memorandums. We need more moral men and women. Policy through the lens of the covenant. The covenant of difference applies to policy in the following principles. Policy must protect, not manipulate. Government is not a parent. It is a referee. Its job is to uphold fairness, defend liberty, and stop harm, not to engineer outcomes for political points. No policy should divide society by race. No law should reward mediocrity. No program should teach people that the state is their savior. Policy must serve the local, not the ideological. One-size-fits-all national policy rarely works in a diverse country. The covenant supports decentralization. Let communities decide their own development paths, whether rural farms, township enterprises, or religious schools. Let policy nurture, not dominate. Let it enable, not direct. Policy must uplift the builder, not the bureaucrat. Every law must be tested with this question. Does this make it easier or harder for a builder to build? The real leaders of this country are not in Parliament. They are in workshops, classrooms, tuck shops, clinics, farms, and churches. Let policy serve the street-level problem solver, not the elite political consultant. Restoring the soul in the public square. There was a time when public office was a calling, a time when statesmen wept over broken communities, walked barefoot to hear villagers, and quoted scripture in Parliament, not for performance, but from the heart. Today we have cadres, not servants, networks, not conscience, deals, not duty. We must restore the soul of governance. How? By requiring moral literacy before political literacy. By ending cadre deployment and making virtue the only currency of leadership. By surrounding public servants with mentors, not only managers. By reintroducing truth and courage as standards higher than slogans and statistics. Where do we begin? With you. The covenant of difference is not waiting for a new president, a new constitution, or a new policy think tank. It begins wherever you are, in how you speak to your children, in how you show up at work, in how you handle conflict, in how you choose honesty when no one is watching. Because when enough people carry a covenant in their conscience, a nation can turn, not by politics, but by personal reformation. This chapter is a turning point. We have moved from diagnosis to action. The next chapters will explore how a society anchored in sacred difference thrives economically, socially, and spiritually, without importing utopias and without denying history. Chapter 7. A nation is a covenant, not a contract. Why paper alone cannot hold a people together. South Africa has constitutions. It has contracts, it has compacts, charters, and policy frameworks stacked in the archives like dried-out promises. But here we are, decaying. So what went wrong? We mistook paperwork for peace. We mistook ink for unity. We mistook the legal for the sacred. A nation is not a contract. A nation is a covenant. Contracts are cold. Covenants are living. Contracts are enforced by courts. Covenants are upheld by conscience. Contracts are broken with loopholes. Covenants are broken only by betrayal of trust, of soul, of something higher than man. And that is why South Africa's post-1994 arrangement, for all its good intentions, is cracking. It was a contract with no covenant underneath. The failure of the contract society. We were told that if we just wrote the right laws, everyone would get along. If we just created the right institutions, fairness would follow. If we just signed the right documents, history would be healed. But no document can save a society that has no shared moral foundation. We cannot legislate unity. We cannot regulate virtue. We cannot contract our way into community. A society cannot thrive if its people do not trust one another. And trust, real, thick, multi-generational trust, cannot be written into law. It must be woven into life. The covenant is older, deeper, holier. A covenant, unlike a contract, is not based on mutual suspicion. It is based on mutual recognition. I do not trust you because the law compels you. I trust you because we are bound by something higher than ourselves. In ancient societies, a covenant was sacred. It often invoked the divine. It wasn't simply about terms. It was about identity, duty, and the soul's obligation to others. Marriage is a covenant. Brotherhood is a covenant. A tribe, a village, a people, these survive not because of paperwork, but because of honor. This is what South Africa must rediscover. Not just laws, not just rights, but honor. The covenant of difference is the missing foundation. In 1994, we signed a contract between parties. But we never built a covenant. Between peoples, we had courtrooms without common ground. We had elections without ethical bonds. We had representation without responsibility. The Rainbow Nation failed not because democracy is flawed, but because democracy without shared virtue is a slow suicide. What the covenant of difference offers is the missing glue. A shared moral, imagination, a shared reverence for difference, not as threat but as texture, a shared understanding that we can be deeply different, but still bound to each other by sacred duty. This is not utopia. It's adult society. Contracts focus on rights. Covenants demand responsibility. The obsession with my rights has left South Africans blind to their responsibilities. People want jobs, but they don't want to study. People want land, but they don't want to farm. People want justice, but they don't want due process. People want peace, but they won't forgive. A covenant society says, you are free, but only as free as you are responsible. You are different, but only dignified if you respect difference in others. You are powerful, but only righteous if you restrain your power in service of others. This is what makes a people whole. The South African covenant must be rewritten in spirit. If South Africa is to survive and thrive, we must renew our covenant as a people. Not by rewriting the Constitution, but by reawakening the conscience of the people. And this new covenant must say, we will no longer seek to dominate one another through ideology. We will no longer define one another by skin tone or suffering. We will no longer wait for the state to solve our moral decay. We will no longer retreat into victimhood. We will rise into duty, into virtue, into soul. We do not need a revolution. We need a covenant renewal, a simple creed for a complex nation. This be our covenantal creed. We are different, and that is sacred. We are bound not by blood, but by dignity. We will not be ruled by resentment, nor divided by race. We believe in law, but even more in character. We carry the covenant within us, and no party, policy, or president will define who we are. Let every South African say, I did not sign a contract with my neighbour. I made a covenant with my future.